talked to so many families of the hostages, the German ones, and for them, I think the most important is to get some sort of sign of life, that their loved ones are still alive.
Right.
What do you think? What are the chances?
Zero. There's zero chance of getting sign of life unless Hamas uses one of them in a video like they did with the 21-year-old woman who they showed, and that's clearly for purposes of psychological warfare to put pressure on Israel. Hamas has no real leverage on Israel today other than the use of the hostages. We have to hope that they will only use them in videos when they're alive and not for other purposes like ISIS.
I mean, it's also unprecedented that it's so many hostages, right?
Yeah.
Do you think it was on purpose or just by chance, you know?
There's the official Hamas story, which I don't believe. The official Hamas story is that they aim to attack 2 army bases and take soldiers as hostages for prisoner release deals. But if that were true, then how do we explain the brutal terrorist attack on the music festival? Those were Hamas in those Toyota vehicles with the mounted machine guns and anti-tank missiles and RPGs. That was Hamas. And that was not aimed at army bases, that was aimed at civilians. So I don't think that they could have expected in their wildest dreams for the Israeli border to be so penetrable and for it to be so easy to get into civilian communities. I think that they lost control because it wasn't only them. Islamic Jihad forces came in, Popular Front forces came in, and individuals with weapons came in. More than 1,000 people, it's estimated, came in from Gaza and committed acts of horrendous terrorism inside of Israel. I can't imagine that they expected they would have 200 hostages. I can't imagine that this was planned because it's against their own beliefs. It's against the Quran. It's against Islam to take women, children, elderly, and sick people as hostages. But they found themselves holding all these. And it's not only them. Part of the tragedy and part of the difficult situation is that it's apparently not only Hamas who's holding hostages. It's also Islamic Jihad and Popular Front and maybe other individual armed people who are not even affiliated with a group or an organization. So it's not something that's controlled. It's not something where there's one commander who's in charge of making decisions on negotiations for their release.
So it really differs from your case.
It's unprecedented, and there's almost no comparison between the case of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, who was abducted in 2006 and took 5 years and 4 months to return him. We don't have 5 years and 4 months to deal with this hostage situation. We have a small window of opportunity that's going to close when the ground incursion begins. Once the ground incursion of the Israeli army begins in Gaza, the chances for any kind of negotiations with Hamas is probably over. Right now there were until last night some kind of negotiations going on. We received notification from the Qataris that they were breaking off their mediation because of what they called the barbaric act of attacking the hospital in Gaza. They didn't wait to determine if it was Israel or if it was someone else who bombed the hospital. It's a horrific act. It's a war crime. It has to be condemned. Whoever did it should take responsibility, but we need the Qataris to continue their negotiations for at least a deal on the women, the children, the elderly, and the sick. I don't think we can negotiate a deal for the young men. For most of the men who Hamas, regardless if they're soldiers or not, Hamas will consider them soldiers and treat them as soldiers and expect to get a high payment for them in return. And this time, there won't be a negotiation for their release.
Like you said, with kind of the same methods as ISIS, there's a new dimension of terror, right?
Yes. Hamas was a body that I've been talking to for 17 years. In the Shalit negotiations, following the Shalit negotiations, we talked about a long-term ceasefire until Israel assassinated Ahmed Jabri, who was the commander of the military forces in Gaza. He was a partner to the talks on a long-term ceasefire that ended In 2014, there was another war, and 2 Israeli soldiers were killed and their bodies were left in Gaza. And then we discovered that 2 Israeli civilians who were not mentally well entered Gaza on their own, an Ethiopian, Avera Mengistu, and a Bedouin Israeli, Hisham Asayed. And for the last 8 years, I've been negotiating, sometimes officially on behalf of Israel, to try and work out a deal. We made progress, but there was a red line that was not going to be crossed by Israel. That was the Hamas demand to release prisoners who had killed Israelis, and Israel refused on that. So about 2 years ago, I decided to try and expand the discussion beyond the 2 bodies and the 2 civilians to a long-term ceasefire, with opening up the siege on Gaza, with normalizing life in Gaza. We began talking about that, but we didn't really make progress. I thought that there were possibilities for doing that if there was more willingness on the Israeli side. I've been pushing for years for Israel to understand that you can't lock almost 2.5 million people in an open-air prison and expect to have quiet. The only way you can expect to have quiet if people in Gaza are allowed to have a life. If young people, the overwhelming majority of people who live there are young people. It's one of the youngest populations in the world. They have no hopes. What kind of hope does someone in Gaza have for a better life? And I've pleaded with the Israeli government to recognize that keeping the siege on Gaza is going to blow up in our faces. I never imagined that the explosion would be as it was. Who could have imagined that it would have been so easy to breach the border, to take over civilian communities, to see the brutal barbarism of the terrorists and what they did? That was unimaginable. And as such, as someone who's been talking to these people for 18 years, and I've been talking to them since last Saturday, Hamas is no longer a body that we can negotiate with any kind of long-term arrangement. They have no right to exist as a governing body anymore, and their existence will continue to be a threat against Israel.
So Biden was also trying to postpone or negotiate the march in, or what you said, the ground.
Right, the ground incursion, yeah.
Yeah. So, but now we have a totally new situation since last night, right? Do you also, what does it mean for the hostages?
It's not good. Every day that goes on is not good for the hostages, and every day of a war brings the possibilities that non-combatants, civilians, innocent people will be killed. And again, we don't know what really happened at the hospital last night. I have doubts about the stories of both sides. I don't want to discuss it. I'm not a ballistics issue. And I'm not sure that it really matters. We have a large number of casualties of human beings who will add to the collective trauma that we're all experiencing that we're going to have to deal with at the end of this. I don't see any scenario where Hamas is left ruling Gaza at the end of this war. And the killing of civilians makes it more difficult for Israel to accomplish its mission, its primary mission, as I see it. Not that I'm the one making the decision, but what I understand to be the decision of the Israeli government, the military, with a very wide support to the public, is that the primary directive is to remove Hamas from its ability to govern and threaten Israel. And the second directive is to free the hostages, not the other way around. The hostages may be, a large number of them may be sacrificed in this operation. I am sure that one of the reasons why the operation hasn't begun yet on the ground is because Israel is carefully collecting intelligent information from the hundreds of telephones that were left on the bodies of terrorists that they caught. And plus, Israel has the technological ability to enter the telephones of almost anyone in Gaza. So I'm sure that they are doing that, probably with well over 1,000 intelligence experts in the special unit, collecting tactical information on the Hamas plans for the battle for the defense of Gaza, information about the tunnel city underneath Gaza, information about booby traps, information about where the hostages might be. I think it would be safe to assume that the elite fighting force, the most disciplined Hamas soldiers, are not the ones who are keeping the hostages. They were the ones who were keeping Gilad Shalit. There was complete discipline. For 5 years and 4 months, Israel never found out where he was being held. You can't hide 200 people. and they're spread out for sure, and they're held by different people. There is a chance that some of those people who will not be the most disciplined or the elite fighters of Hamas may decide to desert their post. Maybe they don't all want to be killed. One thing that they should all know is that anyone who's holding a hostage is going to be killed. So there may be people who will desert, there may be people who will turn over hostages. Israel has said, and I think they should continue to say this, that anyone who turns over a hostage will be granted amnesty, will be freed, will be allowed to leave here. There's even some Jewish person abroad who's offered to pay large amounts of money to anyone who turns over a hostage. I think these things need to be amplified to the population in Gaza so that everyone knows, because there have to be intelligence leaks of where these people are. They're either underground in the tunnels, or Gilad Shalit was in the basement of a family's house for a year and a half. He heard the family above him. So there must be other people like that holding hostages now, and they have to know that they can save their lives, maybe save their homes, if they turn over hostages. But if they don't, the Israeli Special Forces are going to go in with the ground incursion, with the tanks and the artillery and the infantry, maybe ahead of them, maybe behind them, but they will engage in special operations to try and rescue as many hostages as possible. They will have some successes, and they will have some failures.
Oh, thank you so much information already. I was wondering if you can just talk about the Holy Land Bond.
The Holy Land Bond is something developed through my other hat that I wear, which is the Middle East Director for International Communities Organization, ICO. ICO is a British non-governmental organization based in London that works in conflict zones with failed peace processes. This is the mother of all conflicts, and this is the mother of all failed peace processes. One of the things that ICO does wherever it works, and it's working today in Cameroon, in Kosovo, in Cyprus, and here, is the idea that we engage in normal conflict resolution methodologies, trying to bring decision makers or people close to decision makers together to rethink the failures of the peace process and to think of new ways to address it. But we also add to it an economic component. ICO was founded by a British investment banker named James Holmes, who his wealth has been brought to the table and his ability to raise large amounts of money. So when we met and decided to start working here, he asked me if I had a large amount of money. And I said, $50,000. And he said, how about $250 million? I said, okay, let's think seriously. What could we do here that would have an impact? So the first thing I said is housing for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, Palestinians are being driven out. There's no zoning plans. When they get zoning plans, when they get building licenses, Palestinian developers don't have access to finance. They can't get mortgages and fund from Israeli banks or Israeli insurance companies. Until now, they haven't been able to take money from Palestinians. So they can get licenses maybe, and thus this current municipality in Jerusalem has been granting large amounts of building licenses along the tram tracks in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. So we came up with a scheme that we're negotiating with 3 Palestinian banks now, where we will provide guarantees for loans. So we can turn $30 million into $150 million in loans, because we're going to provide AAA U.S. Treasury guarantees for the loans that Palestinian developers will get. That's a negotiation that was ongoing until the war. The other model that we're working on, and this came after the eruption of violence that took place in Israel's mixed Jewish-Arab cities, was let's try and build and own and sell properties, apartment buildings for Jews and Arabs who want to live together. So integrated housing in Israel's mixed cities. We did a market survey in 3 cities and found that if we manage to develop these projects, there are people who would be interested in living in them. It'll be a challenge. More Arabs were interested than Jews were interested, but there's more of a housing shortage for Arabs than Jews. But we believe that in some of the mixed cities, Haifa, Akko, to begin with, we can find developers and properties, and we can do that. And the last thing that we started looking for, and we haven't found yet, is to support joint tech ventures, either between Jewish and Palestinian Israeli citizens or cross-boundary between Israelis and Palestinians. businesses that are not startups. We want to find established businesses that want to expand, that by us providing investment, for instance, an Israeli high-tech company will be able to hire another 20 or 30 or 40 Palestinian high-tech engineers, that kind of thing. So that's what we're looking at. And in the ICO hat, which is not the investment, before this war broke out, I've been running 3 secret back channels between important Israelis and Palestinians looking at the day after. And the day after was the day after Netanyahu, the day after Mahmoud Abbas. Now what we're looking at is the day after tomorrow, is what I call it. Because this war will end and we will have a tomorrow and we will have the day after tomorrow. And we're going to have to address the reality that in Israel, we've been living in a delusion for 56 years that you can occupy another people and have peace. We've been living in the delusion that you can put 2.5 million people in an open-air prison in Gaza and have quiet. That needs to change. The Palestinians need to be much more serious about creating a decent home for themselves without corrupt governments and without fanatics running them. So we have a lot of work to do, and I'm hoping, and I keep writing this and saying this, through these horrendous trauma that we're all going through, that the situation is going to be so traumatic for all of us. For Palestinians, this is a repeat of 1948. This is the worst trauma that they have experienced in 75 years. Hamas has brought them back 75 years. For Israel, this is the worst trauma that we have been through since our creation. We have never been attacked in this way, never. Not the Yom Kippur War, not any other experience was our border so breached and civilian communities attacked and butchered. I am sure that our governments on both sides are going to have their day of reckoning, and the people of Israel are going to kick them out. They're responsible for bringing us to where we are, and they are going to have to pay the price. What we don't know is who is the new generation who's going to stand up with new ideas, new hopes, new dreams, new visions, and the ability to rally support of their people. We're all going to remember. No one's going to forget. No one's going to stop blaming the other side. But we have to begin looking forward and not only backwards.
Thank you. Maybe it's you, you know?
Maybe. Yes.
Yeah, maybe if I was 20 or 30 years younger, we don't need another Biden. You know.